Okay, so one of the things we're going to emphasize is performance anxiety. One area I've worked in sport and business is around performance. So it could be around delivering a presentation, feeling a bit anxious, going out to a big sporting event. Having worked in sport at the highest level across a broad range of areas, anxiety, as you can imagine, is a big thing. Equally preparing for an event, it could be preparing for an exam, it could be preparing to go on radio, to appraisal a situation. So that's one of the areas I've certainly worked with for a long time. As I mentioned sort of yesterday, we sort of spoke about mood and depression, anxiety in one sense too, generally speaking, irrespective of whether I'm working with someone in sport or business, I always suggest they do see a GP first of all too. You're wondering, why do you do that? I'm going to talk about more why I think it's important to do that as we sort of roll on with this module. So what is anxiety? That's the big question. Okay, so fear, to clarify, is a short-term emotionally state that's triggered. It's immediate danger of a harmful stimulus. So it could be a wild dog, someone coming at you with a weapon, a dangerous spider. It's there. You can see it. Okay? That's fear. It's a real threat. It's there. That's not to say anxiety isn't real for the person experiencing it, but anxiety is an uncomfortable emotional state which continues and is triggered by anticipation and imagination of a dangerous stimulus. Internal, external. So, okay, going back to performance anxiety, it's the appraisal of the situation, of doing a presentation, the appraisal of doing or sport, failing or not winning, the pressure, external. It could be our perceived danger, so it could be our perceived response. So maybe that experience in the past, and something triggers that. So, for example, it could have been that you experienced a big bang, and something happened simultaneously, and then you hear it again implicitly, and it sparks a reaction. But equally, it's the anticipation, imagination, inadverse, the fear being there. So, anxiety is real for the person experiencing it. Fear is there. Does that make sense? Does it clarify it there? Okay, so fear is there. The snake is on the ground, you can see it. The spider, the person, the weapon is there. Anxiety, where it's not there. Anticipation, imagination. Okay? The biological response is the same, irrespective of the trigger. Same biological response. Okay, so we talked about that before. To answer your question, in terms of diagnostic, a mental health professional will do the diagnostic. So that could be a psychiatrist, for example, and they use a criteria, the DSM-5 or the ICD-11. So diagnostic guidelines for anxiety and fear-related disorders. Okay, the ICD is, we mentioned yesterday, the WHO. It classifies not just mental disorders but all recognized diseases and medical conditions. Okay, the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's used by clinicians and psychiatrists to diagnose psychiatric illnesses. The DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association and covers all categories of mental health disorders for both adults and children. The DSM is utilised widely in the United States for psychiatric diagnosis, treatment recommendations, and insurance coverage purposes. So it serves a purpose, gives the person something to work with for prognosis, diagnosis, but obviously, like we mentioned yesterday, in certain situations, there are limitations to a diagnosis. In one sense, that's not suggesting that someone doesn't go get a diagnosis. I certainly recommend someone goes to see a professional to get that, if that's what they need, or if that's what they require, or if obviously they need treatment. But equally in saying that, we mentioned before that there is a criteria there, but also outside that criteria as components, and it may be appropriate in certain situations to explore those components, as in sport and business. But equally saying that it may be the person requires clinical help. So clinicians utilise the manual published by the APA, American Psychiatric Association, to determine whether a set of symptoms and behaviours meets the criteria for diagnosis as a psychological disorder. The International Classification of Diseases, published by the WHO, is also used frequently. More so in Europe, the ICD, and more so in America, the APA. Okay, so the outline, the DSM-5 outline specifies criteria to help professionals diagnose general anxiety, and the ICD-11. That's something I can't do. It's not in my remit capacity to do so. Hence, I'll refer someone to, well, I suggest someone go see someone who can, if they're experiencing anxiety, for reasons that we've discussed about, obviously, getting the best possible help that they can. Okay, so the former DSM category of disorders became 3 separate categories in DSM-5. So from 4, it became 3 separate categories in the 5. And you can see the 3 separate categories of anxiety. 1, anxiety disorders. So you've got separation anxiety disorder, selective mutism, specific phobia, social phobia, panic disorder, agoraphobia, and generalized anxiety disorder. Second category, obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic, hoarding disorder, trichotillomania, and excoriation disorder, free trauma and stress related disorder, reactive attachment, disinhibited social engagement, PTSD, acute stress and adjustment disorder. So the categories of anxiety disorders became separated, 3 separate categories in the DSM-5. So types of anxiety, to reiterate: separation anxiety, social phobia, and anxiety disorder, social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, agoraphobia, PTSD, panic attacks, and general anxiety disorder. Okay? So, categories. Okay. I'll send that through to you anyway. Did you get that? Sorry, yeah, sorry. Okay. So the DSM-5 outlines a specific criteria to help professionals treat and diagnose. Okay. During an assessment, what the clinician will do is make an assessment and a clinical judgment to make a diagnosis. So I'll use that, as well as their skill to talk about the symptoms in an open-ended way, and possibly questionnaires, as well as to come to that conclusion. Okay. In the UK, NICE guidelines recommend a systematic assessment for anxiety disorders to consider the specificity, severity, and degree of functional impairment of disorder. There are specific scales for measuring anxiety as well too. Okay. So NICE guidelines make evidence-based recommendations for treatment. It's the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. Okay. So I think it's really important too. In addition to that, I think it's really important if someone suffers from anxiety, particularly if they suffer from anxiety almost out of nowhere, they start developing symptoms. That's not to say if they've had it for a long time they shouldn't get it checked out, but equally if they do arise consequently, literally out of nowhere, then all the more as well, we're getting it checked out. But sometimes anxiety can be mistaken. There's other conditions that overlap as well. We talked about organic conditions yesterday in depression, and equally think with the anxiety, there's an overlap. Now, I'm not a medical person, I stress that, and I don't profess to be or know or be an expert in the area, but I know enough to know, based on the courses I've done over the years and the research I've done, that there are conditions that can have an overlap, and one being peptic ulcer disease, sleep apnea, frets or stress, so someone could be threatened or stressed, and that's from anxiety, Cushing syndrome, that's cortisol, thyroid dysfunction, hypothyroidism, vitamin deficiencies, substance misuse, medication induced, some medication can do anxiety, neurological conditions, depression, asthma, caffeine, and other disorders. So, okay, the person goes to the GP and they get a battery of testing to see if there's any biomarkers in these areas. And if there is, they can get the treatment they need of the appropriate person. That's not to say they can't work with someone, who is a therapist, in the sense that you then clearly define what you're working with. Because all the work you do is going to have limited value if someone's got obviously a condition, if they vitamin deficiency, if they've got a thyroid problem, if they've got a tumour, then irrespective of what work you do, obviously there's a problem there that needs to be treated medically. That doesn't fall into, not my remit, depending on you guys. Obviously you've got variable backgrounds, but it certainly doesn't fit in my remit. So that's why it's really important in that respect. And even if it's just sport or business too, because, one doesn't know. One never knows. You might have an athlete who's sort of got anxiety out of somewhere, and then, they could have a vitamin deficiency. Thyroid problem it could be. It's not related to the actual performance itself. It could be in business. Someone's afraid of losing their job, or possibly, they've taken substances, or it could be something unrelated to the actual appraisal of the situation. But equally, those feelings, those emotions and feelings can attach themselves to that appraisal too. So there is that. Brain tumours, stroke patients, dementia, epilepsy, cerebrovascular disease, traumatic brain injury, they can all produce anxiety. Okay, so it can be mistaken for that. That's not trying to concern anybody. That's sort of safeguarding the person. As suggesting earlier, well, if someone comes along, could you do some work with me around anxiety? Well, have you seen a GP for that? No, I haven't seen a GP. They say, well, perhaps you do go see one and get checked out and see what they've got to say, and we'll bat from there. Alternatively, it might be they go see a GP and they might get a clinical referral, because it could be a problem they have that is deep and needs clinical help, and so on and so forth. Alternatively, it might be they do get referred and they do come back and you can do some work with them on a certain area, if that sort of makes sense. Nice guidelines. Mental health professionals have evidence-based treatments. Now, we talked yesterday that for some people that can be frustrating, because some treatments that work for some people, they're not evidence-based, or they're not on the guidelines, and they can't get access to that. It's not for me to say what one should and shouldn't do, but I've certainly worked with people around these areas and had considerable results. I don't have all the answers, but I've certainly worked with people and done hypnosis. And I mentioned, I think on the last course that you guys were on, the young girl I was working with had very severe anxiety, who literally wouldn't leave the house for a long period of time, and she felt she wasn't getting anywhere with the people that she was working with. That's not undermining the system. They were great professionals. I don't know what work she was doing there, but it wasn't working for her. So I had the professional courtesy when she approached me to explain what I could do with her, what we could do to her family, to her parents, the work I would do based on what she told me, and I had the professional courtesy to ask her to speak to a clinician, and she did do that. And then I spoke to a clinician over the phone and said, well, she's asked to work with me. The clinician said, well, I don't have a problem with her doing that, but there could be an issue with her seeing me on my formulation, and it might be that because she was being treated through the NHS, that they don't carry on treating her. So I had to tell her that if you start working with me, then there's always a chance that you can't go back to the person you're working with. Not that I have a problem with it, but protocols are protocols, and we stick to guidelines and protocols. And she said, well, I've been doing work for a long time in that area, and it's not been working. So let's have a go with you. And I said, fine. So we had a go, and so the story goes, she got her life back, and touch wood, she's still got her life back now after many, many years. And I say many, many years, if you're going to look at longitudinal studies, not that it's a study, I have the time and patience and money to do a study on that. It sort of goes to show what works for one person might not for somebody else. And I'm not saying I can help everybody in that situation, because I certainly can't, but it does go to show that, there are things that we don't know. And whether, what I did, the work I did was around, placebo, whether it was a belief, and who knows, she's not complaining. And neither of a number of clients I've worked with in that area. So I say one has an open mind. And actually, to be fair, the consultant that she was seeing, a really good consultant in the area that she was working with, actually got a secretary to write me a letter to say that they want to know a little bit more about what we did. And there was nothing Grange about the work I did. It was just, basically a combination of modalities, but hypnosis being one of my preferred methods. And they're going to touch on some stuff today, but where it's appropriate and applicable. And I share that story because it's really important that, from a safeguarding point of view, I think, in my opinion, that you tell the person you're working with, if they're seeing clinician, that this is what we can do potentially, what are your thoughts? If they turn around and say no, we're working on formulation, then fine. But I suppose the buck stops with the person, but you can only propose and put forward in that respect. So the main role of the amygdala is to trigger the fear response. So the smoke detector in your brain, the amygdalae, there's one structure on both sides, and the main role of the hippocampus is to store fear memories. Okay, and the main body response to the fear are freeze, fight, flight. Hence, I suggested earlier this morning that people who have trauma or have suffered trauma may find sitting there and doing mindfulness intrusive, because there's nowhere to run, nowhere to fight if you're having to sit still. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. So, and generally speaking, there's two main routes for processing threatening stimuli. This comes from the work of the famous neuroscientist Joe LaBouffe. Some great work, and this is my interpretation of his work. Two main routes of processing threatening stimuli: slow and fast response. Okay, the fast response happens without conscious appraisal. Okay, the slow response, information is first processed in the cortex and includes evaluation of threat. So this happens bang, straight from a text message, from an email, from a sound in the background, and you don't have a chance to appraise the situation, or not even aware of what's going on, even so. This happens where you actually process it in the part of the brain, the logical part of the brain, you evaluate the threats. You actually read the text, you read the email, you evaluate what's going on, a slower response. Okay, you evaluate it, it goes through the brain, the cortex. Okay, but equally, irrespective of whether it's one or the other, or a bit of both, what are the effects on stress hormones in the body systems? Well, we know, and any of us sort of had a bit of a fright, okay, and you know what happens, the blood pressure goes up, mobilization of stored energy to the muscles, transient enhancement of immunity. So, as people with prolonged stress, the immune system, the research suggests, is affected because, you're having to mobilize, and you've got an impending threat. You've got a much more immediate threat. High levels of cortisol. Okay. So we see late maturation of frontal cortical areas associated with delaying executive functions. So executive function is important to modulate fear. So that logical part of the brain, the orchestra of the brain that pulls things together. And that probably suggests why in adolescence the anxiety becomes prominent because the brain maturation and the ability to rationalize isn't as it is as we develop our frontal brain. So, for example, there's been experiments where you take teenagers and they're sort of told they're being watched in a room, and they've seen a much more severe neurobiological response to anxiety than, say, someone who is older, who's got more maturation in that respect. But equally in saying that, people that have damage in that area. So you ever saw the story of Phineas Gage, so he damaged it through the railroad accident. The bar goes through his head. He damaged the frontal part of the brain, and that altered his whole personality. He's almost like a different person, the person he was prior to the accident. Impulsive and much more aggressive. So this part of the brain orchestrates. So looking at things from a broader perspective and genetic and environmental influences. So research suggests certain genes influence the risk for anxiety. The 5-HTT-LPR gene associated with reactivity, the threat, and the neuroticism trait. So all but the big five, the traits, they're not linked pathological, but there is a bit of a correlation between neuroticism trait and anxiety. So there is a correlation there in that respect. So what have animal studies showed? Inadequate care in early life is associated with increased reactivity and stress, anxiety in adulthood. So for example, let's say you didn't get love and attention and soothing growing up, and there is evidence to suggest that that is a higher risk factor. And the experiments like the rat licking experiments, where in the world of rats, the way they show love and affection, the mother, she within that first week and beyond, she licks the rats, and they sort of stumble across that in an experiment. Well, they stumbled across that really, but what they did notice in one respect, it was that the rats that were licked maternally in that first week, even years after, would be less aggressive than the ones that weren't. So translating it to human experience, it might be that in the way that we show love and affection to the children, so the child who doesn't get that can have an impact, certainly in their behaviour. Absolutely. But gene correlate too, because then you think, well, why doesn't everybody have the same thing? Well, we know now it's genes environment. Okay, genes environment. So environmental factors interacting with DNA, methylation, and gene expression, the light switch. So we talked about that yesterday in depression. You're cruising along, you've got two twins cruising on this path of life, and one of them goes through a big relationship breakup, or a big adverse event, and they have depression. The other person doesn't. So you can see that correlation between the two. But it's hard to untangle what causes what or what's involved in what. That's a good idea. You've got classical conditioning theory as well. So a neutral threat can become an associated threat. A threatening stimulus becomes associated with a neutral stimulus that occurs simultaneously. So this theory underpins fear extinction training in the likes of, say, CBC for anxiety. Okay, so you've come across the Pavlov dog, and you've read that, and naturally the dog, if it smells food, salivates. The ringing of the bell, the dog doesn't salivate. But then when you pair the two together, ring the bell, put the food out, and take the food away, ring the bell on some, the dog salivates. So the sodium, what was it now? What was that sodium called? The little Albert experiment. Yeah, it's a little Albert experiment. So no known fears other than falling and loud noises. In the 1920s Watson Rayner experiment. Now you couldn't do this now; it would be unethical. But the point being is they gave the little Albert a white rat to hold. It was tame and it would hold the white rat. But then what they did is they would bang a loud noise behind his head, until eventually what happened when he went to hold the rat? What happened? Do you think? He kept afraid. Two were paired together. Okay, so we see classical conditioning, which is different to operant, which we can sort of touch on very briefly as well. But CBT, from that perspective, sort of going off piece a bit, and sort of builds on behaviorism and as that cognitive element. It suggests that psychological distress can be the result of early life experiences, and that led to the framework of understanding the self, world, and others that we sort of touched on. But for me, it's about the one stick in there even when it comes to anxiety, because we've seen before it can be very debilitating, but it can also be correlated to different things. So I certainly tell people, stick to your remit in that respect, and err on the side of caution if you're not sure, and get the person to see what the thing. But this is sort of some research you can sort of see in the build-up, and the Pavlov experiments we talked about there, the salivation, the ringing of the bell. Watson, Rayner, they studied Pavlov's work, and this gives you sort of a build-up to where we are, and we can sort of look at some interventions and go from here. A bit of a history behind it. So, you've got Watson, Rayner, and they sort of proved that in human beings through studying Pavlov's work, and phobia. Okay, that was the Sudian, the little Albert experiment, which is now unethical, but the baby became afraid of the white rat, and other things that were similar to white rats in association. And then Skinner comes along in 51 predominantly, and he builds on the work of Thorndike, and predominantly for experimentation of rats, he demonstrated principles of positive reinforcement and punishment, positing that extinguishing fear would not eventuate in avoiding the fear, suggesting avoiding the fear or phobia would be seen as a reward itself. So the behaviourist approach worked on the foundation of unlearning the conditioned response. So you would unlearn the response, because what you would do is avoid the actual thing itself. Okay, so extinguishing of a fear would not eventuate in avoiding the fear, in one respect. So suggesting avoiding the fear or phobia would be seen as a reward. And if your reward be bad, what do? You're damn doing more of it. So he's thinking, well, unlearn, but then you sort of get the theory that this is quite reductionistic, in the sense that, according to research, behavioural approaches to phobias and maladaptive behaviour be considered reductionistic. They don't take into consideration biological and psychological factors and social elements of developing a phobia, maladaptive behaviour. So, okay, can we really narrow it down to one thing? Maybe we can, but maybe we can't. So this genes, environment. Would the same have happened to other children who were paired with a loud noise? Or possibly not. Who knows? Okay, so behavioural approaches, science of behaviour, the focus point is on behaviour. So you can consider that as being reductionistic, because you're not considering other factors. Okay? Behavioural approaches, learning theory, the focus being external, not internal, suggesting that humans are a blank state at birth, the tabula rasa. Are we really a blank slate at birth? Are we really all, well, possibly, but possibly not, because we know that, okay, some of us can run quicker than others. Some of us have got, green eyes, blue eyes, and brown eyes, and, physiological differences. So, from a perspective of the brain, we know that we've got different character traits. We know also that the heirloom of the grandparents, the parents, genetic, how your grandparents, were they, their diet could have an impact. The studies, the famine studies, the Dutch famine studies that, that talked about different parts of the Netherlands after World War II. Some parts were starved by the Nazis as the war came to an end, and some parts had food, but they sort of studied some of the people who were deprived of food, and they saw that it impacted them behaviourally, even up to the grandchildren. So there's many things we've got to consider. Environmental factors impact behaviour. In the case of a phobia is learnt through classical conditioning, positive behaviour can be learnt unlearned. Okay, so then you sort of, from a CBT perspective, Beck comes along and suggests cognitive model to posit appraisal situation. So your appraisal of a situation could be, how do we sort of put that across? So your thoughts. So what goes through the mind of someone who enjoys doing presentations, do you think? Great, it's a chance to present, I'm going to enjoy it. What goes through the mind of someone who dreads them? Precisely. So it's your appraisal of the situation, which has a big impact, which sort of leads to a cognitive model, restructure thought process. But equally in saying that, you sort of transfer that across to phobia as well. But building on the work of Ellis, Beck builds on the work of Ellis, and the interpretation of the situation, the thoughts cascading, a cycle of connected and meshed through the appraisal situation that link to emotions, feelings, behaviour, physiology, according to Beck. So, you know the ABC model. You've come across the ABC model before. Long story short, situation, event. It's not the event, it's your appraisal. And that has an impact on you, emotion, behaviour, physiology. But that's not linear. It's sort of, one, the other, and you can sort of separate that mesh, so to speak. According to Woolf, systemic desensitization, exposing a person to fear itself moderately in a relaxed state, gradual exposure. So, for example, if you're afraid of spider, now maybe if we do put a plastic spider at the end of the room and you bring it closer, gradually, that exposure in a relaxed state can help you overcome the fear, moderately. Okay? Moderately. Or it could be you have a fear of maybe flying, and maybe you're going to simulator. So in a relaxed state, gradually, as much as you can tolerate. So if you're afraid of spiders, not putting, say, I don't know, someone into a room full of spiders, that would be too much. So extend the comfort zone, so to speak. My words, not the words of Foa and Kozak termed the process exposure treatment. So you've got the exposure treatment. Okay, exposure treatment. What I would say, as we sort of roll along and I present hypnotherapy models and how we can work with people with anxiety, keep an eye out for people who've got disciplinary imperialism or the tendency to claim academic different backgrounds, claiming a privileged view of behaviour, of health behaviour. No one has all the answers. It's complicated. 84 billion neurons and trillions of cells. It's a complicated system. What we can say is biological influences on health, infection, physical trauma, hormones, nutrition. They impact behaviour. Psychological influences, emotions, attitudes, self-control, social environment, family, peer, economic status. Okay, they're all factors to consider. It's really important to be holistic and cover every stone. Okay, they all have a factor in behaviour. They all interact in a way that contributes to individuals' health and health behaviour. Okay, so we want to think beyond the reductionistic approach, who try and explain behaviour biologically, psychologically, sociologically. Let's look at the big picture, okay, and put a case forward for what we can do based on our remit to help one go from A to B. So, for example, if someone has anxiety, depression, alcoholism, if they go see a doctor, then they're biological, aren't they? So they're going to look at it from a biological point of view, discuss biological interventions. Okay? Psychologist, therapist, coach believes that, it could be the psychologist's view of someone who drinks excessively, for example. It might be down to wanting to escape depression or anxiety. They may treat an alcoholic for depression. They might treat anxiety with coping strategies, cognitive thoughts, appraisal. That might be their approach. A sociologist would be analyse anxiety, or if the person's got alcohol or whatever it is, social factors. Okay, So who's right and who's wrong? Well, all three might be right to some degree. Okay, the fact is that not one of these responses address the complete problem. We all should be working together to find a solution, because the reality is that, human beings, there are many subjective realities as they are individuals. Okay, one way we can investigate is the study of language and communication through the exchange of messages, either verbal, non-verbal. That can be useful to do. Experiential, stimulating a realization, reorganize real states and restructure thought process and perception. Appraisal, by reaching deeper in the evolution of our brain and access existing resourceful states. Okay. In anxiety too, there's been research suggests that there's attentional bias, that ambiguity, the bias is on the scenario that can present anxiety. So let's say you face an example. Let's say, for example, the attentional bias. Let's say, for example, someone who is prone to anxiety receives a message, a voicemail from the local GP. Okay? And the voicemail is, could you come in and could you give us a call, please? What do you think the person who's prone to anxiety is going to think? Yeah, precisely. And the person who's not, what do you think they might think? Well, it might be just an annual checkup. But using an extreme example, I think we'd all be concerned, to be fair. But the point being the ambiguity. Okay? The ambiguity, response, can't make sense of it, they're going to lean towards that. Okay? Perception events, we can only perceive events from our experience. So, what we're going to look at the appraisal of a situation. Let's sort of explore our appraisal. So the cascade of feelings, responses, bodily changes. We can look at the appraisal of a situation. Now we appraise that situation. Upon reappraisal, the ambiguous situation is not as dangerous. So the person who gets the call from the GP secretary, could you come in, then speaks to our resident therapist. He gives Kathy or Andy a call back there, and you say to them, actually, what else could it be? And they say, well, it could be the annual checkup. It could be to see if I've changed address. How do you think they might start feeling then? A bit more neutral. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. Reduce the set of fear response. We're flooded with sensory information, and we sort of pay attention to one component. Selection mechanism to attention. Okay? So what I do is, you can see here the fear response, which is a real response, being chased. But the irony is, there's been so much more research done on response, and it's like, I was reading a research paper a while ago about snakes could be an innate response, actually. To fear response. Actually, snakes would be innate. And when you think about it, it's quite logical in one sense, because at one point we might have been, food for prey. If we go back from evolutionary history, before we had all these structures to protect ourselves, the reality is, as human beings, we didn't have a frontal cortex as developed as it is. We'd be toast, man. What chance would we have? Seriously, what chance would we have in terms of fighting off wild animals and that sort of stuff? So we probably would have been prey. So when you think about it, there could be that evolutionary history where embedded innately certain responses. So maybe there's a lot more mileage around there, but we'll go into this in a little more detail after break about how the thalamus gets information from all the senses. The amygdala gets it straight away. Okay, the amygdala, it bypasses so smell goes straight to the amygdala. Okay, bypasses the thalamus, but the thalamus gets the information generally from see. So you sort of see this dog coming towards you, or someone walking towards you. So let's give an example. Let's say you're sitting down. It's a nice summer's day. You sat there outside, and as you sat there outside, relax, someone starts coming running towards you. You see the person, you hear them, and they're sort of shouting. What's your immediate response, do you think? They're calling it, sort of pointing, like that.
Well, there's some sort of fear there that something bad can happen, isn't there?
Possibly, exactly. So the thalamus is the central focal point for sight sounds. It breaks down incoming data by size, colour, shape. Auditory data by volume and discord. The thalamus signals the cortex. The cortex gives the sensory data context and meaning. Conscious appraisal, what you're processing through your senses. You're thinking at that point, what's this person want? What they're going to do? Okay? The prefrontal cortex is crucial for switching off the anxiety response. It's the handbrake. Once the threat has passed. The amygdala is the emotional core of the brain. The primary function of the amygdala is to trigger the fear response. Not the only thing it does, but it does that. Okay? Now the point being, at that point, okay, you realise, well actually as it happens, the person's shouting, he's saying, you know, Andy, you recognise you've dropped your wallet. It's behind you. Yeah? And before, you know, the flock of seagulls can come and pick up, you know, and you realise I'm okay. But the key thing is, he's got like a response. He's responding, man. The cortisols flood the body, neurobiological responses happen. The key point there is how quick the prefrontal cortex. Now, in a developed person, you know, obviously there's multifactorial around that. That's crucial to switch the anxiety response off and sort of calm down back to baseline. Okay? Back to sort of baseline to assess the danger. Okay? And we know in certain situations, certain people in injury, how do we know that's really important? Because we know the brains that have been studied over the years. Phineas Gage, the brain injury, and so on and so forth. And you can see when damage is done to the prefrontal, but also underdeveloped, the teenager, possibly, they might be more prone because they can't switch it off, so to speak. So the exam that they're told they've got to sit, they find it hard. Because they're wondering, what if I fail? My whole life's ahead of me, and blah, blah, blah.
So do you, in like a panic attack scenario, is that prefrontal cortex cut off then?
Well, we talked about the slow loop and the fast loop, and sometimes it can bypass that. It all depends, I suppose, on the situation, but equally in saying that, depends on the person, depends on the individual, depends on the nature of the panic. But I think in panic disorder, I think it affects 1 in 75 people. I stand corrected, I'm going off the top of my head here. But the point being is that, okay, great point. So all of a sudden, you know, you smell something and it reminds you of, you know, so you walk past the hospital and you have that smell of hospital. But if you experience a situation where you're in hospital for a long time, a bad experience, that's going to trigger. And so you trigger panic. And before you got a chance to process it, frontal, you set off that neurobiological response. So it can bypass that, but not only that, it can shut it down. Because the primary goal then is survival. Because the thalamus sends information to the amygdala, okay, if it's not bypassed through smell, and the amygdala is associated with emotional significance. Okay, so the amygdala sets off an immediate burst of fear. So in technical terms, the bed nucleus of the striatum keeps the fear response going, causing the ongoing feelings, if it's a genuine response. So if the person coming towards you actually had like a stick or something that they're going to attack you with, that would keep the response going. The next port of call would be to logically think, well, can I call 999? Can I get away? But equally, in saying that, it cannot be distinguished by the brain. Spatial awareness, temporal, like a bolt, it's quick. So one thing that we'll look at is that, okay, the focus on how we can use the prefrontal to switch the threat off once it's gone away. Okay? How we can use it. So in sports people, we do a lot of prefrontal work. Because you know they could take a penalty in training every day and score. But you know when they're thinking people are watching them and, you know, all the pressure that external, and all of a sudden they go to type before a point they knew how to do the technique. So prefrontal work is really important too, because the point is, how can we use the prefrontal cortex to switch it off as an appropriate threat once it's gone? Because we talked about the person walking towards you, and the following day you go back to the same place, the person's not there, but you still see him there. Okay? Imagine response. You think, well, what should I have done? Should I have, got up and ran? Should I have attacked them? All these things are going through your mind. Okay? And that obviously can become pathological in post-traumatic stress, because obviously, in severe cases, it can be really debilitating. But the point being, from the point of view, we talk about the response. The blood pressure goes up, the heart rate goes up, the pupils dilate, so we're preparing ourselves. So the amygdala pre-screens for danger, getting some information from the hippocampus from past events, past experiences, because the brain is there to keep you survival. So it's getting it from past experiences, memory stored. You store the memory, the feeling. Okay. The hippocampus is the memory center. It stores raw information from our senses, along with emotional data from the amygdala. Raw info. The amygdala is activated by the hypothalamus to trigger that fear response in the body. Okay. And going back to Andy's point, it can deactivate the rational brain. Okay. In a severe response, the rational brain is deactivated. And you'll see sometimes people talk about emotional hijack, for example. You look at some of the work of, I think it was Goldman around emotional intelligence. He talks about how in certain situations the rational brain gets hijacked, where at that point your thinking brain is hijacked. You're not thinking rationally. Okay. Hence, when I train people in the media and managers in football, take press conferences, I always say to them, before you answer a question, if it sort of triggered you, just take a drink and buy 6-7 seconds, because that sort of, you trigger that response. So the logical brain pushes the logical brain. Okay, when I say have a drink, I'm not saying they drink vodka, by the way, or wine, because that would cut the brain completely. It's just a water, just enough time. Just enough time to just disguise the fact that they're having time to think about it, and then I'll answer it more logically. Have you seen people answer things irrationally? We go back to the press conferences. I didn't know these people personally, but it likes of Kevin Keegan when he got really riled up. He really riled up at that press conference. Do you remember that in the press conference? He sort of really got. He lost it, and because he loses it, then the players kind of think, if our leaders lost it, then you know what I mean. It's like that has an impact, doesn't it? So you can see people get really riled up. So buy yourself time. Quite a useful thing to do in that respect. So fear, anxiety is primarily through the senses. Sight, sound is first processed through the thalamus, filtering in incoming data and sending it to the amygdala and cortex. Smell straight to the amygdala, bypasses the thalamus. Okay. Then from any incoming data, the senses associated with the threat in the amygdala, whatever it is, really imagine, anticipated, past, present, it's going to trigger the response. Because the brain doesn't know what's real, not real in that respect. It makes no difference. So the brain, if the brain hears a big bang that reminds you of, if say, for example, someone sort of heard a huge bang fighting in combat, and they hear a big bang and they're in an office, the brain implicitly doesn't differentiate that. It triggers the response. So hyperarousal. So we see hyperarousal, going off piste a bit. Hyperarousal. So for example, let's say for example, that shouldn't be confused with emotional sensitivity. But let's say for example, let's use an analogy here. Let's say for example, someone sort of taps you on the shoulder. It's generally okay. But if you're sort of sitting in the scorching sun and you don't have to put your sunscreen on, they tap you on the shoulder, what's going to happen? It's going to have a different response. Kind of scolded, bang, don't touch me there. So it could be someone says a word and the word's emotionally laden. Okay? Does that sort of make sense? So when I was working in care home, many years ago, in educational system in care home, there was I think it was an Ofsted guy. I can't remember call now. It's been so long ago now. But anyway, he came in and he was sort of, because I'm doing an educational lesson, so to speak, and he came in and sort of was observing me doing the lesson I was teaching. The young person I was working with, he came in and he sort of did this, make me a brew. But that sparked the reaction in the young person. The reaction in the young person was based on her abuser would do that before he would abuse her. And bang, it all went off and she went after him. Okay? In that respect. So it happens at such a breakneck speed. And he was no threat to her in that respect, and he was just doing his job, but obviously implicitly, really imagine, anticipate a past present, it triggers the response.
And that's where the irrational behaviour comes from.
Well, precisely, and the more options you've got, the more you can sort of rehearse things, the more you can do things, and the more you can deal with triggers, and we'll sort of touch on some of the things this afternoon that are appropriate and applicable. But glands release active chemicals called hormones, and these active molecules that create emotions and moods. Okay? So before you can consciously process the fear, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland cause adrenaline glands to pump out high levels of cortisol, stress hormone. So in the work I did a year ago, when one of the sports scientists of one of the biggest clubs in the world said to me that one of the issues that they had in sport was the fact that the players after Champions League games had very high levels of cortisol. They tried a number of things to reduce the cortisol, and I suggested that mindfulness and hypnosis could be potentially useful. There's a body of literature out there that says it's potentially useful for stress response, and I'm not saying it's going to appropriate everybody, but they looked at different things, and I said, well, that could be an option for them, because if you're playing a game in the Champions League on a Wednesday night and you're travelling 2 hours by plane, it seems like a great deal, but what does cortisol do in high levels? It starts disrupting your sleeping patterns too. It's a knock-on effect. By the time Saturday comes along, Sunday comes along, you're sort of sluggish, lethargic, you haven't slept, you've got builds up of lactic acid in the legs that hasn't gone out, and so on and so forth. So my suggestion was to look at maybe other alternatives that are not intrusive in respect to, obviously there's diet, nutrition, there's other things that they can look at. Not my remit, but my remit certainly would be to examine potentially cognitive strategies, but also, the likes of mindfulness and hypnosis and how that can help in that respect. High levels of cortisol aren't good. A lot of research around that. But high levels of cortisol short-circuit the cells in the hippocampus too, by the way, making it challenging to organize the memory of a traumatic experience. Therefore, memories become loose, context, and fragmented. Okay, in one sense. So the fragmentation of the memory, but it's there. Okay.
Jim, can I ask you? When they prescribe drugs for anxiety or something like that, what are those drugs actually affecting? Is it the cortisol?
Well, it depends on the drugs, but it depends on what they're prescribing them for, and there's it depends on what they do. I couldn't really answer that because it's not really right in my remit, but one of them where, for me, they work for some people, and certainly I would suggest anyone who's got any sort of anxiety to, if that's what's being prescribed, then follow the prescription. But where anxiety is concerned, it all depends on the nature of the anxiety. It all depends on the person. So one treatment might not work for one person, not the other. But we touched on some of that stuff yesterday too, in terms of SSRI receptors for depression and trying to increase serotonin, and the antipsychotic sort of has an antagonist effect, which sort of cuts it off. So I think for me, going down that area, it's one of the things really that the person, it's about finding something that works for them. It may not work for them, but equally in saying that the individual, there's a lot of permutations. Severity of anxiety, how it's affecting them. As a general rule, one thing to think about is the sympathetic nervous system. That kicks in, and when that kicks in, the heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, hyperventilation, sweat. These are the physiological symptoms. Hyperarousal, the adrenaline pumps blood, so preparing for fight or flight. the brain turns its attention away from digestion, and that's why sometimes in certain situations people tracks potentially empty, because you're looking for survival at that point. Okay, so for example, if there's people faced with danger in an airline or something like that, then the brain's going to turn its attention to digestion, away from digestion. It's going to shut down. Okay. Only after the fear response is activated, the conscious mind kicks in, and some of the incoming information goes through the cortex, and the cortex decides whether the information is as a fear response, is it genuine threat or not. To close, before we go to break and we come back and look at some techniques for performance anxiety, and so on and so forth. Let's think about it almost like a tennis match between the amygdala and you sort of got the primal brain, logical brain. For me, let's think about it this way. You hear a big bang, to surmise, in summary. You in bed at night, you hear a big bang in the kitchen. What's your immediate response, do you think? Is that an intruder? You start to feel anxious. You decide, I might go downstairs and investigate. And as you go downstairs to investigate, then your logical brain says, I left the dishes over the edge. And then you kind of do the tennis match going on between the logical brain, primal brain, until eventually you walk downstairs, check the door, it's locked, the dishes on the floor. The two come into agreement. Now, the cortisol floods the body, and you might still feel a bit jittery for hours afterwards, but equally in saying that you can sort of bring yourself back. Okay, so the key point being, from a therapeutic context, is to go from maladaptive to adaptive. Okay, from a performance point of view, it's orientated towards the goal, and that could be anxious going to a big sporting event, delivering a presentation, but delivering a presentation, if not prepared for it, is a big thing too. Sporting event, if they're playing against someone who is beaten them on other occasions, who's got more talent or is higher ranking, that could be an issue too. There's many issues too, but even we covered earlier before, there could be other things that sit within a different remit. That could, like you mentioned, require possibly medical help, and also it could require other interventions. It could be non-related to the appraisal of the situation. It could be an organic condition too. To give you an idea, even working around performance for me, I think it's really imperative the person who comes along just gets things checked out, just to be safe. And if it comes back as being something that they need to, that's outside your remit, so you can't carry on work with the person, but if you work with the person, you agree what you're going to work on. And if your interventions are appropriate and applicable to that person. Equally, if all things being well, we're going to look at ways this afternoon to work on appraisal, and we're going to look at ways to reappraise situation. We're going to look at ways to understand the components, and we're going to look at ways that we can use various interventions to help people minimize that and perform to the best ability. So lunch till 1:35, is that okay for everybody? Yeah. Fantastic. So after lunch, we're going to go into some more detail, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.